All right, hermeneutics. When you hear that, some of you may have heard the word, others are probably like, that makes no sense, I have no idea what that is. What did Herman do? That's big words. Now, we're going to, of course, then define this for you, because that would matter. So, hermeneutics defined, this is just essentially the process of interpretation. You'll see this most readily with interpreting Scripture. Here's our process of interpreting Scripture, but it would be applied to any ancient text. Anything that's out of our culture, you're going to have to take this, maybe intentionally apply a hermeneutical process, whether you know the word or not. Right? You're going to put some sort of hermeneutical process. That process might not be very good, or it might be really precise. Hopefully we want to get better at it and have it more precise. But that process is something you're going to do mostly with these ancient texts. But you're doing it in our own culture all the time too. You just don't have to think about it. Because why? Because you know the language, you know the context, you know what the circumstances that are going on are. Right? You know all these things. You understand the figures of speech that people are making. And so you don't have to do any kind of extra thought about it. It just naturally makes sense, and you have all the context. But you're still doing it, even in our own culture. But we have to be more intentional when it's outside of our culture. When we're going back in history and I understand, okay, I need to actually really specifically do this thing or that thing or that thing. So we'll talk about what those things are. But the purpose is to identify the meaning of the text. The purpose of the hermeneutic process is to identify the meaning of the text. Now, meaning and application are distinct. And we just heard a little bit about that. And so just reiterate, so if you're looking for the application, you've got to get the meaning first. Otherwise, it's just a relativistic application. But oftentimes people, we skip the question of meaning and jump right to the application. Now when people are saying what this means to me, we want to get rid of that. But oftentimes what they mean is how it applies to me. That's what they're referring to. Well, look, we just want to be more precise with how we talk and not say it that way, but it's, okay, what this means, how it applies to me. Okay, but first, before I could ever get there, what does this even mean? What did Jesus mean when he said that? What did Paul mean when he said that? So that's just the key things as we look at this overview. So there's 5 keys of interpretation. There's your list. And we'll talk about each of these real briefly. But genre is a style, like a style of writing or a style of movie. We're familiar with that. The audience who's being spoken to. We just had an example of that in Jeremiah. The historical context, what's going on. Literary context, getting beyond the verse in question. And then, of course, the word meaning, taking us into the original languages. So we'll talk about just the scope of each of these. First, on the genre, you got 8 biblical genres. So as we look through Old and New Testaments, we find, well, there's history, there's historical books. There's books that are really focused on law. We have biographical narratives. That would be like the stories of the Gospels. We have epistles, otherwise known as letters. We have poetry. We have parables. We have prophecy. We have apocalyptic. I started that because sometimes some people will just say that's a part of prophecy. Some people want to break it out. I don't care. Whatever you prefer. The significance is I want to know what I'm reading. And some books are going to have maybe 2 different genres within them. But I don't even know what I'm reading. Am I reading a parable or am I reading history? That's a really important distinction. One of the most obvious ones. Am I reading law or am I reading poetry? This is just, it's Proverbs is giving me insights, or this is a law, or this is instruction coming from Paul on maybe even doctrine. Important to know. Huge errors are made on this, especially by non-Christians. And you'll see big errors from them right on this first one. Here's some examples. For some of the books you find the genres in. Parables are not books. They're not whole books, right? That would be a section or segment within a book. All right, audience. There's 6 audiences within just the New Testament. Who do we have? We have Jewish non-believers and Gentile non-believers. That's going to be 1 book each. Then you've got books that are to all believers. Then you've got books that are to just Jewish believers. Then you've got books to Gentile believers. Oh, then you've got books to individuals. Well, I might want to know, who is this directed towards? And a lot of things that are straightforward, okay, it didn't make a difference, but when things aren't straightforward, that might help. So here's some examples. Matthew would be the book directed to a Jewish non-believer, an evangelistic book explaining things from a perspective that the Jews with their background and their context will understand, and they'll make connections. But Mark approaches it very differently, of being directed towards Gentile non-believers, also evangelistic. Based on the audience, if I'm saying, you're talking to someone and they're like, I don't know much about this, I'm not a Christian, what should I read? Where would I start? Mark. If they have no background in like Old Testament because they're not a Jew or haven't been a practicing Jew or something, well then you're a Gentile. We'll start with Mark because that's who it's written to and it's written for you. I'm a new Christian. I've kind of read a little bit. I'm wanting to grow. Okay, well guess what? John's a great place to start because that's directed towards believers. Luke's kind of one that comes in, but where it's almost for all. You could say for all people in general. Just the general, like, here's the whole story. But then you see certain books for the Jewish believers, for the Gentile believers. Romans is an interesting one because it's both. Very, very specifically for both. He's talking to both groups. And then we have the books to individuals. So those are examples. Third, we get to historical context. What are we talking about? Well, there's 2 aspects. You have specific circumstance. What's going on that might not be mentioned, but the people getting the letter, they know what's going on. Other times it's mentioned, and we get a clue, and we might, well, that's mentioned for a reason. But if it's not there, there's still the question, what's the circumstance? What is it that he's referring to that might be significant in helping us understand? Or the other aspect here is that there's cultural norms. And those can be a little elusive. We're like, well, I don't know what they're talking about. What's this norm? What does a certain thing mean? They're referring to something, I don't know what it is. Well, you got to do some research. And so this can get a little daunting because I don't even know where to look. But we aren't getting into that right now, but this is the kind of things you have to understand and know that I need to look into. Now, literary context is what we were just talking about with never read a Bible verse. And so here's just a quick picture of that. 7 layers. It's like the target. You have the verse in question, and now I move into the verses before and after I get the complete thought. And now it's still not clear, I'm moving to the chapter. And then I move in maybe the entire book, because maybe I'm in chapter 4 or 5, and there's going to be clues about what it means in chapters 1 and 2. Well, what did he say previously? So I got to go back. And if I'm in chapter 12, that's annoying, because sometimes you're like, okay, there's a lot I got to read. Well, then still, we're not understanding. It's hard to figure out. Well, maybe the author. What other books the author wrote that does he address this issue in another book? So I'm reading in Galatians. And he also talks about this in Romans. So now I'm going to go and get the full context from a different book. Ultimately, then, I maybe go to the Old Testament and trying to figure out what other authors say within the New Testament. And then occasionally, they're referring to something that's not even in the New Testament. And you're going to the whole Bible or the other Testament. And this is when it gets overwhelming, perhaps. And this is where you're thankful for these things called concordances to help. But this essentially is never read a Bible verse. But that's what a picture of what the process would look like of that. It gives kind of a structure. So I know, okay, here's how I can approach it. And finally, word meaning, the original language. We're looking at Greek, we're looking at Hebrew, and depending on what book we're in, where you're doing, there's word studies, we're looking at Bible dictionaries, we're trying to figure out, okay, what's the sense of this word that's in the original language and what that really means. Oh, actually, there's like 3 or 4 different meanings to the word. Maybe there's more possibilities than I thought. How do I do this, right? Okay, well, at first, that's daunting. The more you do it, the more it makes sense, and the more clear it gets. And it starts to become natural. And that's all I'm going to do on this, is just give you that overview of how things would fit together in this. And what you start to see as you approach it is you go to the church and you hear your pastor preaching, and you suddenly hear him do one of these. Now, why did he do just one? He didn't take us through a step by step, because he's done the research, he's done the work, and he's like, this is the one that matters and makes a difference today. And he starts talking about the Greek word. So here, what we need to talk about here is the Greek word. He's doing hermeneutics. It's just he's processed it through and identified that's what we need to talk about. Other times it says, well, okay, so here's something that's important is what's happening at the time is, and what are they doing? He's doing historical context. Other times they say, okay, so we're in Romans, we need to go over here to Ephesians. And there's a connection we need to draw. What are they doing? Literary context. Or he may be saying he's in chapter 4, and he's like, we need to go back to chapter 1, and so here's the context. He's doing literary context. And what you start to see is your pastor's doing this. And that's a good thing to see. And ultimately, we want to, the more we know what's going on, the more we're able to start doing it ourselves in our own reading and asking those questions. And then you find there's a lot more questions you might start to have.